our next program, which is in collaboration with Riverbend Cemetery. They have just redone their office building, and they're having an open house on April 24th between 2 and 4 o'clock. And our wonderful docents, led by Jan, are supplying the refreshments, and you know they always do an outstanding job. There will be short guided tours of the cemetery. Tony's going to be one of the ones leading that tour. And there'll be a very short program at 2:15 for an explanation of what they've done to the office. There will be exhibits of the progress, and we're working inside that new office, and it is very nice.
Yes.
So I think you'll all enjoy seeing that. I'd like to introduce Bob Madison, who is a retired professor from West Point, the Naval Academy. That was great. And then from the University of Arkansas, where he taught while his wife Karen was teaching there. I don't know the name of the Sherlock Holmes Association to which you belong, but I'm sure you'll.
I'll clarify that, yes.
And so enjoy. There'll be
Thank
questions
you.
and answers at the end.
First of all, it's a tradition at Sherlock Holmes gatherings to have a door prize. So towards the end of this talk, you'll want to make sure your name is in that soup bowl over there. So you'll be eligible to collect a very nice annotated set of the Sherlock Holmes short stories. There's an entirely different set for the novels, but that's the one that's up for today. So I am Bob Madison, Professor Emeritus of English from the United States Naval Academy, not to be confused with any other organizations. Although we have friends, it's surprising how small a community it is, given that one school is 2,000 miles away in Colorado, and another one you know is only 20 miles away here. West Point's on the near Poughkeepsie, excuse me, and we're in Annapolis. Annapolis was founded after West Point, which was the first of the major academies, and it was founded in Annapolis because there had been some naval training programs that had gotten a little too independent, and Congress wanted to be able to be sure that these guys were a day's ride from the nation's capital, that they couldn't just say, well, we're at sea and we, you know, the captain is in charge. So that's one reason why the Naval Academy is Annapolis. I mentioned that at Sherlock Holmes societies it was a tradition to have a drawing. What's a Sherlock Holmes society? The highbrow version of that in the United States are the Baker Street Irregulars, which you can join only by invitation after becoming a noted Sherlockian. But nearly every region has a smaller organization that people like me belong to. In the lower Connecticut River Valley, it's the Men on the Tour, named after a chapter in The Hound of the Baskervilles. I see you have a nice hound shirt on there. And the one in Providence is the Cornish Horrors, named after a story set in Cornwall. Those are both organizations that not only encourage people to come and attend a couple of times a year. There's usually meeting at a restaurant, so food is provided, you pay for it. And then there's a talk and the usual presents and so forth. So today's talk is based on an article I wrote for the Journal of the Baker Street Irregulars. It's called the Baker Street Journal. And the printed version has a lot more detail than I'm going to talk about today. And you can see that detail now because you have the books in front of you, which you can't do in an article. But it's also a tradition of these societies to speak of Sherlock Holmes as if he were a historical character, and to talk about Arthur Conan Doyle as if he were only a literary agent on the behalf of Watson in publishing these stories. when I talk about or teach Sherlock Holmes, I like to do something that's applicable to both. So I may talk about Sherlock doing this or doing that, but there's probably a good external historical reason why that's applicable to the story. My own background is on discovering how books get to be written, which means that I'm very interested in what an author is reading him or herself, or where they're going, what their life is, what are the crises in their life that they're responding to. So that's what I'm trying to do today. So I'm not making up any of this history about the books today. Everything is real. But it may get a little fuzzy as to who's actually carrying the books and reading them. So readers of Sherlock Holmes remember that among the 56 short stories and 4 novels written by Doyle, either Holmes himself or Dr. Watson occasionally mentions a book by name. In one story, The Adventure of the Empty House, Holmes, disguised as an antiquarian bookseller, carries a whole stack of books. Watson clumsily knocks them from the bookseller's arms, noticing that one is titled The Origin of Tree Worship. Holmes, as elderly bookseller, is quite testy with Watson, but later, with his dozen books under his arm, he follows the doctor to his rooms to apologize. He says, "Here's British Birds and Catullus and the Holy War, a bargain, every one of them," and then he plumps half a dozen books or 5 books on the table in front of Watson. He says to Watson then, they would just fill the gap on that shelf. Watson turns to look, and when he looks back, Holmes has removed his disguise and Watson faints. But that is the plot of the story, and I'm interested in those books that he put on the shelf because the books that he names are real. For a long time, I just assumed, as somebody, it's not my field, that the bird book, The British Birds, was a book called Bewick's British Birds. Bewick's British Birds was famous throughout the 19th century. It was the book that the young Jane Eyre read when she was locked in the Red Room and was feeling very abused. And she read this because it had lots of little vignette pictures, almost every single page. You can't come close to seeing it from here. I am going to pass this one around. These are the most famous wood engravings ever made. They're by Thomas Bewick, who also wrote the text, but he's much more famous as an engraver. You need a magnifying glass to see the detail. And the engravings in this bird book are very rarely about birds. They're about ordinary everyday life in Britain. Well, I thought this was the obvious candidate. All the titles say History of British Birds or something on it. And then when I started looking into the Sherlock Holmes stuff, it turned out, well, there were other people who had different candidates. That particular set of Bewick's Birds is in 2 volumes in one. Most of the time you find it in 2 volumes. In Jane Eyre, she had volume 2 and threw it across the room. But she does mention the volumes of British Birds. So 2 volumes makes some sense in the 5 volumes that are plunked on the desk, or the 12 or so volumes that he has under his arm. But people have argued, well, it's probably not Bewick because we actually need 3 volumes. If he's named 5 books that he puts on the table, one is the Holy War, one is Catullus. Now you need a 3-volume bird book. And the Holmes scholars nominated this one by Yarrell, and its title is very simply British Birds. So I found that very convincing. It doesn't have the same type of everyday engravings as Bewick, but as you can see from a distance, it does have perfectly satisfactory engravings of the birds themselves. But it's a different thing. Nothing particularly noticeable about the text of this book, I don't think. I will pass that around. But just a nice set. Once you get into this, though, you realize there were 5 or 6 different books between 1800 and 1900 when Holmes is writing these stories. And they all are called British Birds. British Birds of Cornwall. British birds in their haunts, British birds in their nests, British birds. And there's just so many that you don't know. Now, Doyle's not making up these names either. So there had to be something. There had to be a real book on his shelf. Which one was it? Well, before we get back to the birds, I want to talk about the two easy ones. They were the Catullus and the Holy War. Catullus, who knows who Catullus was? Who had Joe T for Latin? Who was Catullus? He was a Latin poet, and he was a lesser poet. And the poem that we end up looking at here is a lesser poem by him. So Holmesian scholarship has pretty much established that the Catullus, which had the essay on tree worship that Watson mentioned earlier, is an obscure 1892 translation of a poem called The Addis by Arthur Conan Doyle's later neighbor and friend Grant Allen. Watson explicitly states, "I remember that as I picked them up, I observed the title of one of them, The Origin of Tree Worship." He did not say that he recognized the book, which might have been the case if he had known the work beforehand, and remembered that, as several Holmes scholars have pointed out, the poem and translation of the Addis fill only a small fraction of the book. On this copy, the title and the associated matter appear on the face of a dust jacket or dust wrapper. What's printed on is just like a dust wrapper of a hardcover book today, except oddly, it's a dust jacket over a paper cover. We don't see that very much today. They're absolutely plain on the back. And under this print, if you actually took this book out of its binding, as I did to examine it, it's absolutely plain. There's no indication of the origin of tree worship. So how do you drop this book, Watson, and pick it up? By the way, these are not rare books. These are not valuable books in that sense. So how do you drop that and have it open to the idea of the tree worship? If you do look in here, scholars have assumed that it may have fallen open to page 31. And on page 31 you find Excursus 2 on the origin of tree worship. I'm not going to drop it with the pages open, but I think that would be quite a feat. There it is. Seems unlikely an obvious chapter title would be taken for that of the whole volume, especially when the running head on the page does say The Addis, that's the name of the poem. But it appears Watson was unfamiliar with this particular page or poem, and Watson may not have recognized it at all. Knowing Watson, he may not have even known who Catullus was. Watson might have been more familiar with their later neighbor Allen's broader corpus of scientific and fictional writings, and thus have recognized Allen's name if he had seen it, but it didn't open to the title page. The title page inside says nothing about tree worship, and the name itself is hidden in a whole lot of black letter type. When you're a detective like Sherlock Holmes, you're always applying the principle of parsimony. What's the simplest explanation that would explain why Watson called that, as he did, on the origin of tree worship? A more parsimonious hypothesis may be that the printed dust jacket, as so often happens, was simply lost. And a previous owner who knew the actual thrust of the volume might have scribbled on tree worship on this, because he knew that this was about Catullus and this was about tree worship. So it really is a book about tree worship. If Holmes were impersonating a bibliophile, it's probable that some of his more fragile items were wrapped, and they might be in brown paper or something. That still happens today. If you order a book from a used book dealer, they will send it to you wrapped in brown paper, and it's really nice when you get a book like that. But then you have to identify it. So what would you do? You'd write the name of the book on it. And if the bookseller sold it, he probably knew that it was mostly about tree worship. He wrote tree worship on it. and that's a solution. Now we're getting into the imagination now of Holmes and Watson, right? This is nothing we can prove historically. We do have the book. Whatever the case, something about the fall of that volume was unusual and attracted Watson's attention, or he would have noticed some other book or none at all. And since something unusual did happen, the occurrence might as well have embraced one of the unusual explanations we've just heard. It would not have been above Holmes to have creased that book open on page 31 so that when it fell, Watson would inevitably say it. Watson is accused too often of missing the obvious, but maybe Holmes knew him best and he saw it. In any case, Watson did see the title on the origin of tree worship because he tells us so in the story, and that links him to that factual book. So I'm going to pass it around with it open to the tree worship page. Any of you who need to get up on tree worship, it has nothing to do with the story, nothing to do with anything else. But I can imagine Doyle sitting there in his office, writing a story and needing to name a book and looking up on his shelf to do that. Do you remember Clive Cussler? Died recently. He wrote Race the Titanic. Well, I wrote a blurb about him once for an encyclopedia and corresponded with him briefly. And when he started a new series of books, about halfway through, one of the characters gets shot and somebody says, "Call Doc Madison." I thought, I know where he got that name. It's not me in the book, but it is my name. And I can see him looking up on the shelf for a name he hadn't used. I knew that he used the names of his friends in his fiction, yeah, sure, because he told me so. Al Giordino was a guy he went to high school with, for instance. Now, the second book, Bunyan's Holy War, which I forgot to bring today because it's a huge book and it's on the top shelf. And I don't normally have the minor works of John Bunyan hanging around my house, but I got this one because I needed to find the link. What was the link between that book and Conan Doyle sitting in his office, and then Sherlock Holmes having this among the different books that he wanted? And I found it. There were many, many editions of that work. It was a very popular book. Probably some of your ancestors had Pilgrim's Progress in their house, and that was his famous one, but this was another of his allegorical works. It was fairly short, so most of the time reprints of that books were a little tiny. There was one that was about this big, but it was like 600 pages. So it's as fat as it was tall. Now you couldn't put a dozen books under your arm if one of them was the size of the smallest box of crayons that you might have, because it would fall out of your arms. So I eliminated all the reprints that were that small. And then in looking over them, just a few years before Doyle wrote the story, I found one. It was edited by a couple of ministers. One was Church of England. One was a nonconformist. They were trying to cover all the Protestant bases. And I know nothing about those two guys other than what I just said. And the book is unremarkable except for its weight. It is one of those big coffee table books. We call it coffee table. It would have been in your parlor on the center table with the family Bible, and that's where it would sit. It was an illustrated edition, and the illustrators were very interesting. One was named Salou, and he was a very close relative to a famous hunter in Africa who was named Frederick Courtenay Salou, excuse me. I think this one was Henry. And the other one was a guy named Frister. And Frister was the first man ever to, in print, draw a picture of Sherlock Holmes. So now I know why Doyle had his book in his library, because when he's at his publishers and the publishers say, well, you want somebody to illustrate this for the Strand magazine? Here's what people do. And probably showed them a copy of the Holy War. If he'd showed it to me, I would have chosen somebody different because I didn't like that style of it. And it's no loss that I don't have that book here today. because the illustrations are so undistinguished for people who have other associations that are much more important. The Salut, by the way, was also related to a guy named Morley Roberts, who was another novelist friend of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So one of those ways, those things are all coming together. With the literary and aesthetic associations lurking in the volumes of the Catullus and the Bunyan that the old book collector offered to Watson, we might suspect that Holmes was goading Watson into recognition on the basis of the books alone. One cannot help returning, therefore, to the bird books to look for similar evidence. Was there any evidence in a bird book that that would connect you with either Sherlock Holmes or Watson within the stories or with Conan Doyle outside of them? And I think a good place to begin is with a passage that comes from The Hound of the Baskervilles, where a bird is very important. Let's see if there's a connection. So Watson and Stapleton, the villain, are out walking on the moor. "Hello," I cried, "what is that?" A long, low moan, indescribably sad, swept over the moor. It filled the whole air, and yet it was impossible to say whence it came. From a dull murmur it swelled into a deep roar, and then sank back into a melancholy, throbbing murmur once again. "What do you think is the cause of so strange a sound?" "Bogs make queer noises sometimes. It's the mud settling or the water rising or something." No, that was a living voice." "Well, perhaps it was. Did you ever hear a bittern booming?" "No, I never did." "It's a very rare bird, practically extinct in England now, but all things are possible upon the moor. Yes, I should not be surprised to learn that what we have heard is the last cry of the bitterns. It is the weirdest, strangest thing that ever I heard in my life." Have any of you ever heard a bittern? Okay, it doesn't sound anything like the description of it, and I'll try it. But you can go online and look for American bittern YouTube, and you'll get this. But it's kind of a That's not a low moaning sound, but that's what a bittern sounds like. And if you've bred cattle and heard a bull bellowing, you can see why the bittern's named after basically the bull. It's a botaurus, which means the sound of the bull, the panting of the bull. And in the bull's case, it's hormone driven because it wants to mate. But it's not at all like a cow lowing. It's not at all. You know, the curfew tolls the knell of parting day and all your cows come home to be milked, and it's not at all that sound at all. So I think why it's in there in that context is Doyle writing a sort of a literary paean to Blackmore's story Lorna Doone, which also takes place in a land of moors and has a mystery sound coming from the moors. That book was written about 30 years before the Holmes story, so it's a very popular book. Also was illustrated by some people who illustrated Doyle's stories. So he probably had a copy of that too. And that is also a giant book, and I deliberately did not choose to bring that one. But in that, the edition close to Doyle's time, those illustrators are represented. But here's a little passage about that mystery sound on the moor. "At grey of night, when the sun was gone and no red in the west remained, neither were stars forthcoming, suddenly a wailing voice rose along the valleys, and a sound in the air as of people running. It mattered not whether you stood on the moor or crouched behind rocks away from it, or down among reedy places, all as one the sound would come, now from the heart of the earth beneath, now overhead bearing down on you. And then there was rushing of something by, and melancholy laughter, and the hair of a man would stand on end before he could reason properly." Do they sound alike to you? I think those two passages sound alike. The wailing voice in Blackmore was revealed to be something entirely different. I'm not giving you a spoiler. I'm not going to tell you what it was. But it was not a bittern. About the bittern, Buick writes, "It flies in the same heavy manner as the heron, might be mistaken for that bird were it not for the singularly resounding cry which it utters from time to time while on the wing." That's a different call. That sounds like your average red-tailed hawk. But this cry is feeble when compared to the hollow booming noise which it makes during the nighttime in the breeding season from its swampy retreats. The word booming in connection with this bird should not be taken as analogous to bombs bursting in air or a martial drum. Comparisons to foghorns are more useful, but only if one remembers that each boom of the bittern lasts only about half to 2/3 of a second, like the frequently repeated croak of a bullfrog. Hence the bullfrog's name. It's the same kind of panting. Stapleton's legitimate observation that the bittern had been nearly extirpated is an ornithological detail that suggests a more recent source than either Buick or Yarrell. But in fact, by 1843, Yarrell was already beginning to lament the passing of the bittern. He writes, "Formerly, as Mr. Gould observes, when large portions of the British Islands were uncultivated, and extensive marshes and wasteland afforded the bittern abundance of retreats congenial to its habits, it was plentifully distributed over the country. But as cultivation has extended and the marshes have been drained, its numbers have gradually decreased, and although not absolutely a rare bird, its presence is not always to be reckoned upon. For in one year it may be tolerably common, and then for several succeeding seasons scarcely to be procured at all." Of the voice, Yarrell is a little more explicit than Buick. In the spring and during the breeding season, the bittern makes a loud booming or bellowing noise, whence probably the generic name Botaurus was selected for it. But when roused at other times, the bird makes a sharp, harsh cry on rising, not unlike that of a wild goose. I've heard the recordings. It sounds more like a hawk than a goose. You've all heard geese. Now, there's another book called British Birds. This one is British Birds in Their Haunts. Put those down. Those are my Yarrells. So this is British Birds in Their Haunts. Now, this is much more recent to the time of Doyle. And as you can see from the spine, British Birds is what it says on the spine, and then the In Their Haunts is about several font sizes smaller, so that you could easily call that British Birds. If you needed a book that was only one volume and you had other candidates for the 5 or the dozen or so that he had, come in and sit. And I'll talk a little bit later about it. I'll talk now about that. It's not really part of my talk, but naturally, ever since this story was published, scholars and sometimes just imaginative people have tried to say, okay, what were the 12 books? And they come up with a list. In my published article, I have a list. But that tells much more about me than it does about the actual stack. But that's where the 3 volumes versus 1 volume becomes important, because if you have 3 volumes of the first 5, and so 5 books are of the name, that only leaves 6 or 7 other books to be part of the stack. When I get to talking about those books, we'll see why some of those might show up in the stack too. Anyway, in British Birds and Their Haunts, the author, who is a Reverend C.A. Johns, says, "It is called Botaurus because it imitates Boatum Tori." Leave it to a Church of England guy to give you a Latin explanation for something. But Boatum is the bellowing and the Tori is the bull. The bellowing of a bull. Of Botaurus, the names Bitur and Bittern are evident corruptions, and the following names in different languages are all descriptive of the same particular note. Butor, Roordrump, Meyerdrumble, Trombone, Roortrummel, Roedommel, and Roordrum. And there'll be a quiz on that later. Of the scarcity, Johns says, of late years, so unusual has the occurrence become of bitterns breeding in this country that the discovery of an egg in Norfolk has been thought worthy of recording in the transactions of the Linnaean Society. And even the appearance of a bird at any season find its way into the provincial newspapers or magazines devoted to natural history. Its habits can only be learnt, at least in England, from the accounts furnished by naturalists of a past generation. So by now that bird is being regarded as something highly unusual. It is questionable, Johns wrote, whether any of our modern English poets, with the exception perhaps of Sir Walter Scott, ever heard what they describe so circumstantially. And that is I've never heard a bittern calling. I think that's a good observation, that almost everybody who writes about the bittern hasn't actually heard that call in the wild. With its many additions throughout the creation of Sherlock Holmes canon, with its large British birds and relatively inconspicuous in their haunts, embossed on both spine and front board, Johns's work is a reasonable candidate for the old book collector if one imagines only a fat single volume is required. Although he doesn't cite Hound of the Baskervilles, Arthur Cecilio Johnson uses Stapleton's phrase, "the last of the bitterns," as the title of an article lamenting the passing of the bird and the need for sanctuaries. He describes the voice at length. Suddenly the desolate marsh was awakened by a ringing, booming voice that pierced the misty darkness and vibrated in the still air. No echo followed that weird, mysterious call, that deep metallic ring, as when a bell no longer swings. But the desolation of the moors seemed more desolate as I listened and wondered what the sound might be. The night hugged the silence, nature held her breath, until again that lonely booming voice broke the stillness and died in a tone of despairing lament. Passion was in the voice and love, a challenge was there, yet a sublimity and a loneliness that haunted the very breath of spring. Once more the vibrating tones were swallowed up by the darkness, but once again they pierced the night air and rang in a cadence of passionate deep-toned booms that shook the sounding marsh and awakened the desolate places of the sleeping earth. Even as the lightning smites the heavy-laden cloud and disperses it in drops of rain, so that penetrating voice struck the brooding darkness of the moor, and the abiding peace in little fragments was shattered and forgotten in a multitude of thoughts. By that author's own admission, quote, "It is probably 25 years or more since the last love song of the bittern was answered," end quote. I imagine that Johnson's authentic childhood memories may be difficult to distill from his overwrought adult prose, if he had ever heard the bittern at all. I rather suspect he had recently read Hound of the Baskervilles and was inspired to adapt Watson's set piece to the service of conservation. The idea of the bellowing of a bull is older than the English language. We have phone baontos en te haremo, which is the voice bellowing in the wilderness, if you would, of the New Testament. Baontos that's the word for the bellowing. It may be impossible to ascertain accurately the sources of the various murmurings on the moor, but undoubtedly Watson, this is where I'm getting fictional now, Watson must have consulted some work of natural history when he went back to Baskerville Hall after hearing that. In the later adventure, Holmes may be attempting to jog Watson's memory by presenting him with an ornithological text that Holmes knew Watson had already encountered. Of authors of works short-titled British Birds, Yarrell and Johns could perhaps have brought Watson somewhat closer to the living bird than Bewick or most of Watson's contemporaries. In truth, there are too many titles that contain the phrase British birds and too little internal evidence in the canon to make a definitive choice among them. Individual works may also vary in the number of volumes from edition to edition, so the same title sometimes fits different theories. Bewick, like Bunyan, has the benefit of the most common association with the title, and I have seen some early copies bound with British birds stamped on the leather spine. Of the popular mid-century candidates that I've seen, Yarrell most consistently has the spine title British Birds, whether appearing in 3 volumes or even 4. It's just within the realm of possibility that Holmes procured an advance copy of W.H. Hudson's British Birds. Do any of you know W.H. Hudson? He's another Englishman who ended up in South America and then came back and wrote about it. So Green Mansions, that's the author. He hadn't written it yet, but he came back, and in The Hound of the Baskervilles, if you've read it recently, you may remember that Stapleton's father had disappeared to South America. So there's a real reason why these plot elements and the books might be there. The problem is, in the fictional story takes place in 1895, but it's not actually written till like 10 years later. So of course Doyle could have this on his shelf when he's writing the story, but then when you put it into the arms of somebody, it's supposed to be 1895, it would have to have been an advance copy. But I think after all of what everybody's looked at, Hudson's probably the one. This is the one that Doyle probably had on his bookshelf. This is what Hudson said. The bittern, formerly a common bird, is hardly entitled to a place in this book, since it has long been extirpated as a breeding species. So flat out, that agrees with what Stapleton said. It is, however, a noteworthy fact that the bittern comes back to us annually, as if ever seeking to recover its lost footing in our island. Stapleton comes back to murder the heirs of the estate. Once he's finished murdering them, it will be his. So he's come back. He's the lost claimant. I love that. When flying, he utters a harsh, powerful scream, and he has, besides, a strange vocal performance called booming, a sound that resembles the bellowing of a bull. Formerly, when the bittern was a common bird in England, this extraordinary evening performance was the subject of some superstitious notions. Superstitions? You mean like an imaginary hound running around the moor? And it was commonly believed that, to produce so great a volume of sound, the bird, when screaming, thrust its beak and head into the water. Thus in Thomson's Seasons we read, "The bittern knows his time with bill submerged to shake the sounding marsh." That's the same quotation that we heard Johnson writing about before. Had Watson not been so precise with his dates, one might be tempted to believe that Stapleton had read Hudson's account with its lost claimant motif. Okay. There's much more to be said about the books at Baker Street. Especially intriguing is what Holmes, Watson, and Doyle discovered in French belles-lettres. I mean, it seems like that's an arbitrary jump from birds to the French, but it isn't really. This is an emphasis that comes from looking at Doyle. Sherlock calls his nemesis, Professor Moriarty, the Napoleon of crime. But to most Victorians, that phrase would probably sound redundant. Napoleon was a criminal. So you wouldn't say the greatest criminal of crime. You wouldn't say the Napoleon of crime. Obviously, whoever could come up with the phrase Napoleon of crime must have had a distinct definition as an individual, which probably derived not from the English, who were his enemies, but from the French. Doyle was fluent in French. He read widely about Napoleon and gave his detective French ancestry. Sherlock Holmes's grandfather was Vernet the artist. Holmes scholars don't really know which one it was, but they like to say that it was the one who was famous for painting pictures of Napoleonic military scenes. Some of the examples of the French influence are represented in the books over there, and I'll just quickly go through those because I didn't do very well in Miss Baruzzi's French class, so I have to have English translations of them. If you want to follow this subject up, fortunately for us, Doyle wrote a series of essays in which he just explained why the books in his library were in his library. And it comes up with things like his favorite novel. His favorite novel was Ivanhoe. That speaks very highly because there are a lot of novels to choose from. He had a set of Scott, but he wore out the Ivanhoe volume, so he had to get another volume that he writes about in dark green cloth that would have been published near the end of the century. So I decided to find if I could find a dark green cloth copy of Ivanhoe that kind of fit that description. And I didn't have to go very far. Edinburgh, Adam and Charles Black, 1886, which fits perfectly. So there's no mystery here. If you are a current heir of the Doyle estate and have access to his library, which exists. But the Doyle papers, including the library, have been off limits to scholars for about 60 or 70 years, ever since Doyle died, which means there is an answer. You could go to, I think the books are in Switzerland now, you could go, and if you could get permission, you could just very simply look at the shelf and find out whether this edition of Ivanhoe or Hudson's book of British birds were on Doyle's shelf. We can't. But Through the Magic Door at least tells us what were there by title, and sometimes a little bit more. Look over at that shelf and tell me what is the favorite color for Napoleonic books. Here is Marbeau at this end. Marbeau over there is represented by editions both in French and English. And Doyle thought that he was the greatest of French soldiers under Napoleon, or at least wrote the greatest books. He didn't quite believe that all the exploits in them were true, and Doyle himself went on to write, outside of the Sherlock Holmes stories, a series of short stories about a French soldier who rises through the ranks during Napoleon's, obviously based on Marbeau. Here is Marbeau at this end, the first of all soldier books in the world. This is the complete 3-volume French edition with red and gold cover, smart and debonair like its author. So we've nailed it. We know it's right there. It's the one with the half leather binding and the red and the gold stamping. And they copied that more or less in the English editions. One frontispiece has a picture of the soldier as a young man, one as an old man, probably inspired Doyle to write about both ends of the career of that individual. He liked to read about French soldiers more than he read about Napoleon himself, but that's just comparative. He read an awful lot about Napoleon. The contemplation of my fine little regiment of French military memoirs had brought me to the question of Napoleon himself. And you see that I have a fair line here dealing with him also. There is Scott's Life. I have a Scott's Life, but it's 10 volumes of its own. It wouldn't show up under Sherlock Holmes if he only had a dozen other books. The American edition was only in 2 volumes, but I don't know how that would have gotten into Doyle's hands. So Scott's Life of Napoleon was probably a 10-volume edition published in England. He didn't like it. There is Scott's Life, which is not entirely a success. I wrote to a guy who wrote a book about Doyle and the French and said, what was wrong with it? The guy wrote back to me and said, I don't know. So we don't know what was unsatisfactory. His favorite novel, remember, was Ivanhoe, and yet he didn't like the treatment of Sir Walter Scott's. I started reading Scott's Life of Napoleon. The first quarter of the book is just a survey of the French Revolution. I can see why English Victorians were terrified by the idea of revolution after reading what Scott wrote about it. No, Scott was not a revolutionary, so he didn't put it in its best light. But you don't need to really have a stand one way or the other to know that the French Revolution was a pretty horrible affair. And I don't know whether Doyle was somewhat distant from that, being a Scot. The Scots have been traditionally more aligned with the French. I just don't know. But here are 3 volumes of the physician Bourrienne. There they are, the 3 red ones to the left. In French, Bourrienne takes 4 volumes. So in this case, I think Doyle probably had the English rather than the French. But what he used to do, he had an uncle, or I think it was an uncle, who lived in Paris. And when he was a very young man, he visited, and that's where he got interested in French literature, and he began reading all these books. I suspect that he started his Napoleonic reading in French in Paris. Does anyone, he says about Bourrienne, does anyone ever know a man so well as his doctor? Doyle didn't really check things very well. Bourrienne never was Napoleon's doctor. Napoleon's doctor was Antomarchi, and Antomarchi was an Italian who published a book in French about the last days of Napoleon while he was waiting on him as Napoleon's doctor. And that's the one he's confusing here in his book. So even though we have some fairly exact descriptions of what these things are, even Doyle, when he's trying to be clear and trying to be specific about it, may not be. So that's why they're there. Anyway, the French books and the French influence is over there. The Bird books are here. If you have not put your name in the bowl, you better do it before anyone starts leaving, because I have to draw a name out of that to get your prize to you. So, if there are any questions, I will be happy to try to address them. Otherwise, please take some time to handle these books and look at them and see what they are. And remember, when you're doing it, these aren't the exact books that Doyle had in his road, or the exact books that Sherlock Holmes was carrying under his arm, but they're the same editions in many cases. So if you want to feel like Sherlock, just pick them up. Don't try to put 12 of them under your arm. I actually weighed a stack of 12 books that were the best candidates for being in that stack. You could eliminate a lot just on the basis of weight. Thank you all very much.
So, Bob, have you ever tried to look up some of the references that Holmes is constantly dragging off his shelf? These monographs?
Yeah, most of the stuff that... Yes, Holmes, well, he wrote that one. So Holmes has written, I think there are 3 or 4 monographs that he talks about in the stories, which he's written himself. And the first one was an article that he left on the table for Watson to read. It's anonymous. And Watson reads it and says, "What twaddle is this?" And Holmes says, "Well, I wrote it myself," and explains why it was important to his work. And that's I think that's in the beginning of A Study in Scarlet, where he talks about that. The first 2 chapters of A Study in Scarlet were the first appearance of Holmes in print, and that's where you get the foundation of his characterization as a man making his living through the science of deduction. It's wonderful stuff. And then there are other books that he pulls out. The most famous of them are Holmes's commonplace books. A commonplace book is where you cut something out of the paper or some other way, record it on a big thick blank book, and you end up having ledgers of these. They're not exactly diaries, and they require an index. Well, Holmes has an index of all mentions of crime that he's run across and all people connected with crime. So if he says, look up Rudolph Saunders, and he looks under S, and he looks under Saunders, and he finds Rudolph, and it turns out that Rudolph was a bank robber in Southsea in 1864 or something. And he'll have that information to help him out. But those are clearly fictional, or more clearly fictional, and outside the kind of thing that we're doing here. Then there are real books. One that he mentions is a Latin law book published during the reign of Charles I. And he makes a big deal about that. In the story, he gets the name of it slightly wrong and the date of it slightly wrong. But Madeline Stern, who's a very famous bibliographer, was able to track that down and identify what the real law book was that Holmes was talking about. But that was a law book still. It wasn't just any old book. And most of the things that Holmes himself talks about are strictly in his realm of a consulting detective. So the stack of books where the stuff almost seems calculated to make a connection with Watson seems to be a little bit different. It seems to be somebody trying to make a connection there. Yes?
So I have a funny story, which I did not know until I listened to this stuff. We went to Cornwall a couple of years ago, the moors, you know, the whole thing. My brother had forgotten to bring his book of British birds and spent the first day searching bookstores for books on British birds. When he had all of these
I think I accumulated all of these after the Cornwall trip, but it was helpful.
But he's a birder. He was looking for common birds.
The old, the book you're most likely to run across if you go over to the book barn or something today is, I think it's Peterson and Fisher, but it's one of the Peterson Field Guide series, and there's one to British birds. And I just thought, well, I don't have one here, but I'll be sure to find one in any used bookstore in England. And the first one that I found was a Royal Society for the Preservation of Birds. That's their equivalent to our Audubon Society. And it was like, for beginning birders, I got a copy anyway because I didn't have anything else. And I think it was like the third used bookstore that we actually looked at where I found the equivalent to a good solid Peterson or Sibley that really had all the information you need to see the birds. But I certainly thought about, one of the reasons I liked our itinerary on that trip was that we did go to a moor. And Karen and I had seen the moors from Exeter. We were in Exeter, you look out, and you're surrounded by these high hills. What's a moor? Well, a moor typically has a very high elevation, so you're talking about 1,000 feet above sea level. That's higher than any place in Rhode Island. It's pretty much treeless, just because of the nature of, I don't think because of agrarian use, but because of the climate, the nature of the climate that's there. So it's these damp meadows that we associated, or used to associate here, with bogs in New England. But they're very high, and it produces a different kind of texture. And they all have this slight curve on the top. And they are, if you're sitting in a city like Exeter, which has a beautiful cathedral, among other things, and you look out on these moors, it is a little intimidating. And then later, when you're on one of these moors, and it's foggy, and the guides are freaking out because they're afraid you're going to get lost in the fog, and you're from Rhode Island, and you're thinking, how could you get lost on this bog? You know, it's like maybe 10 miles square. You just keep walking, you get to the Pawcatuck River, or you keep walking the other way, you get to Narragansett Bay. You can't get lost. But that's provided you go in a straight line. And apparently these bogs are the moors, are very disorienting, which is why they make such a good setting for the hound of the Baskervilles, which is why an unearthly sound, like the sound of that bittern, becomes such an important trope in literature, even though nobody's really ever heard one. That was serious scholarship. The Sherlock Holmes stuff is fun because at basis you're talking within the fictional world of those characters. You're not necessarily studying Doyle. That's just something from my background. It was easy for me to start applying that kind of knowledge. But you really are talking about Sherlock Holmes as a real person who really did have real books. And some people get really worked out about this kind of thing, about what it was. Well, it couldn't have been British Birds by Bewick because that's only one copy, and he names 5 books, and 2 of them were the Bunyan and the Catullus. So the Bird book had to be in 3 volumes. Period. That's what it is. So it mostly is done in a friendly manner, though, so that nobody ever loses in these discussions.
But that's just the nature of Sherlock Holmes' family.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Because they wouldn't, Bob was talking about the ancient Rome.
Yes.
And he comes back and tell and sort of surprises Watson, who faints because he's been away because of Moriarty and a ball.
Supposedly was thought dead, yes.
So, but when that happened, Doyle was tired of writing Sherlock Holmes. It was such a huge hit that, you know, it took a couple of years of fans writing him and begging him and just denying the demise of Holmes, that he finally came back with The Empty Room, and the rest of those stories came after that. So, Sherlock Holmes fandom was serious then.
It was,
Serious now.
yeah, and there were just as many short stories written after the return of Sherlock Holmes as there were before. So Doyle is very curious. First of all, there's some French books over there by Gaboriau, who was a French detective writer, and his police detective was named Lecoq, which Ellen fortunately looked up for me, I can never remember French names. He had another detective who just sat at home and solved the crimes. His name was Tabaret. And Lecoq, basically dissociated from the police department, becomes Sherlock Holmes. And Tabaret becomes Mycroft Holmes, who never goes out of his club to try to solve anything. He would rather be thought wrong than get up and actually go anywhere and prove it. So, but those two come from Gaboriau. Gaboriau never allowed either of those characters to dominate a book. The book about Lecoq is a wonderful story, but if you go out and you buy the Dover copy today, the Dover paperback, you'll find that you only have the first half of the book and the last chapter of the second volume. Because the middle of it is just some other romance that has nothing to do with the detective story. But Gaboriau did not have faith that that character could sustain a whole work. And in Doyle's first story, The Study in Scarlet, half the book is Sherlock Holmes solving the crime. And the rest of it is the main character being off in Utah and the elders stealing the girl that was going to be his wife and her dying of a broken heart and all that. And then finally, in the last few paragraphs of the book, you come back to Baker Street and Sherlock Holmes. So Doyle inherited from those French models a reluctance to make them the center of a whole work. The next time that, I think it's the very next time that Holmes appears, I believe it's in a second novel, the same thing happens. Too much backstory. The third time it's a short story, and it is Holmes all the way through. And that's where Holmes really takes off as this consulting detective, is in the short story, which Doyle should have known from Poe, but didn't. And so in the beginning of Study in Scarlet, you find Sherlock saying that Lecoq was a bungler. I could have found out the man's identity in 24 hours. Dupin was a fraud. I mean, it was just... Sherlock Holmes, as a character, has nothing good to say about the very characters that Doyle is using and modeling his own characters on. So Doyle had a much higher opinion. But Doyle never believed in, or had a critical sense of what was most valid in his art. Historically, we would all say the most valuable thing is the characterizations of Holmes and Watson. It's those people as people. That's why there are so many Sherlock Holmes adaptations, and they're all happy, they all work. They're not Doyle. I'm sure that many more adaptations have been written or filmed now than Doyle even ever conceived of. They're not part of the 56 stories and 4 novels, though. But Doyle never realized that. He always insisted that his best novel was A White Company, which was a Sir Walter Scott-style historical romance. He dropped Holmes to do this French stuff about his French soldier. This French soldier is nowhere as good in artistic achievement as Sherlock Holmes is. He wouldn't even survive for long as a minor character in a Sherlock Holmes story. But Doyle liked those characters better. So it just shows you can be a tremendously great writer and not really know why you are.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Has everybody got their name in the bowl? Are we ready for Ellen? Do you want to do the honors?
The woman.
The woman,
The
yes.
woman will take care of that.
The woman was what Sherlock Holmes called the only woman who ever defeated him.
Irene.
There you are. Well, thank you all very much. And do take some time to look at these books. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to put these right over here so they're all together.
Thank you. I'm sorry I was so late.
I hope you got something out of it.
Yes, I did.
Good.
Here, it's an adaptation, in a way.
Now, what does it have to do with Gillette, who, of course, is synonymous with Holmes in America?
Right. Basically, in my books.
Oh, you wrote it?
Yes. When things happen, Gillette takes over the stage persona as Sherlock Holmes and goes about trying to solve it.
Well, thank you very much. This means a lot now, knowing
I
you're
just
here.
saw that you were doing adaptations and stuff, so I thought,
Yeah.
I'd come up with
That's perfect.
You know.
That's
And,
great.
When you get a chance, take a
Yes, thank you.
look at it.
Thank you so much.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Are you in the Men on the
I look
Tour?
forward to getting started on this stuff.
James, are you with the Men on the Tour?
Excuse me?
Do you go attend the meetings of the Men on the Tour?
No, I'm trying to. I'm a lot more freed up now, so I'm trying to.
Me too.
Yeah,
That's why I'm
so-
back into this.
Yeah, so I'm trying to join a few things. I belong to the Friends of Gillette Castle.
Okay.
You know.
Well, the
but I'm
connection between them and the group has been John Sherwood. So
Really?
he will put you in touch with. I don't. There's
Oh, I
another
just
name.
met him at
Okay.
a